Hazard Assessment for Agriculture. My name is Kristen Hoffman, a consultant with Workplace Safety and Prevention Services, and I am delighted to be joined by our facilitator for the session, Jay Remzik, another consultant with Workplace Safety and Prevention Services, or WSPS. Jay will provide a much better introduction in just a few moments. A few notes about myself. I am a consultant with our organization today that is formerly an organization with focus upon agriculture. Jay and I have the fortune to continue to support the agriculture sector. I spend more of my time in the southwest of the province, in Niagara region in particular, where we do have many greenhouse structures, many of those that have flower products within, and Jay a little further to the west, where we do have many of the vegetable products within. A note, this session is held in collaboration with the Ontario Greenhouse Vegetable Growers, OGVG, for their members. Jay will make reference to examples, hazards, controls, and other solutions with focus upon not only the agriculture sector, but also greenhouse operations that focus upon vegetables. So we welcome your involvement, and in particular for those who are members of OGVG. A few administration notes as we begin. Computer audio is recommended. There are other options. If you do experience a challenge with your audio at any point, the simplest method is to leave the meeting and return using the same invitation. We will encourage you to mute or remove any other devices or programs that may distract from the session. And there are opportunities to interact with us through the session, although perhaps not with your microphone. There is a chat as well as poll options that will become available. The chat, if not open currently, is available across the black toolbar at the top of your screen. When you open that chat, we welcome you to contribute at any point. Jay and I will have a few questions for you throughout the session, and although there may be polls to capture your answers, any of the other general questions or questions you may have, comments and otherwise, please do contribute to the chat. If there are details that Jay or I can follow up with you after the session, we will also have a point where we can capture your contact information to do so. You are able to adjust the size of the screen that you are viewing if you wish. Within the settings in your Teams client, you can open up to enter into full screen. That will adjust the orientation of some of the sections that you see on your screen, but it will raise the size of that for you. I mentioned polls, and at one point in particular, we will provide you with some explanation of different hazards, and we'll share a few examples relevant for greenhouse vegetable operations. And we would love your feedback on what those examples might be within the hazard descriptions that we provide. When we do have any of the polls come up on the screen, and I will reinforce at the time, simply by Xing out those windows, you will remove it from your view. The goal of our time together today within this safety connection is to provide an opportunity to talk with focus on a particular topic, and in this series for OGVG within a particular sector and further in a particular commodity. We welcome you to network and exchange thoughts, ideas, and suggestions within the chat. And once more, where we can provide follow-up, we will provide a location where you can contribute your contact information. And with that, I will welcome Jay, who will facilitate the content from this point forward. Over to you, Jay.
Thank you, Kristen, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to Safety Connections Hazard Assessments for Agriculture. And as Kristen had alluded to and mentioned, in collaboration with the Ontario Greenhouse Vegetable Growers and WSPS. A little bit of background in regards to myself. I've been doing this for close to 24 years. Very similar to Kristen, expertise is in the agricultural sector. Kristen mentioned she's in St. Catharines. I'm based in London, but my territory is essentially southwestern Ontario into Huron, Perth, Middlesex, Oxford, Elgin, Lambton, Chatham-Kent, and Windsor-Essex, of which I'm heading to Windsor-Essex right after this session to head down to Leamington. So this was an ask of OGVG. This was one of the topics that they had asked us to put together and go through to speak to hazard assessments specifically in the agricultural sector. Okay, so we don't have the option to use the mic, but maybe just in the chat, participants that are in the session this morning, how many have conducted some type of hazard assessment or have a hazard inventory at their particular operation? And I'm just going to pop back and forth just to see if anyone has included anything in the chat. I see a couple of hands going up. That's good. All right. So essentially, it's a means to identify the hazards in the workplace. Or it could be the worker's tasks. Okay, so the tasks that an individual is doing, and what hazards are associated, with that particular job or that task that they're doing. You can see there on the slide that it does go by many different terms. We at WSPS, that's a big term for us in regards to HERA. It's called a hazard identification and a risk assessment. You may very well, based off of your workplace inspections or your hazard assessment, have a risk register, right, or a risk and hazard inventory, as well as that particular hazard list. Okay. So the question is we already have a good safety program. Do I need to have a hazard assessment? Okay. And a couple things here is that it's a baseline, right? A proactive rather than a reactive hazard management, okay? An inventory of potential hazards is captured to allow the business to focus resources and time to reduce the risk of accident or injury. I think the key thing is when we're conducting either a hazard assessment or a HERA, and we'll speak to this as we move through the presentation, to then identify the level of risk associated with that particular hazard, so that we can put the pertinent controls in place to reduce the potential risk. Okay. So without a hazard assessment, it's also speaking to, controls are a scattering approach. A hazard is identified in one particular area, let's say of the greenhouse, and we put a control in that particular area, but we're not factoring in, could that hazard be applicable at other aspects or other parts of the particular operation. Okay, missing certain hazards entirely, treating all hazards equally. And I'll speak to that a little bit further as we work through the race process. Okay, failing to prioritize or giving priority to lower risks over higher ones. We always want to ensure, right, that we're going to be focusing on those high risk hazards first, but not ignoring, right, those lower risks. Okay. Putting controls in place do not offer adequate risk reduction, or failing to consider the hierarchy of controls, of which I'll speak to a little bit later. And then crisis management instead of hazard management, reacting to the issue after the fact. Okay, so this is a very proactive approach to identify those particular hazards and then put those applicable controls in place. Okay, we speak here to lagging versus leading indicators. Okay, so a lagging indicator is data points that identify a hazard after the incident occurs. Okay, The incident is an occurrence arising out of or in the course of work that could or does result in injury and or ill health. Okay, that leading indicator is data points that identify the hazard before the actual incident occurs. Okay, and identifying risk proactively is a leading indicator. Okay, so we speak to, incident reports, after the incident has occurred, but a leading indicator could very well be, having your staff or your employees report near misses. Okay, reporting near misses, something almost happened. Okay, but there's a leading indicator to ensure that we're going to put those effective controls in place. Okay, so this is our incident causation model, and if we work from the top, okay, in the red, and move from the left to right, you can see there that you've got inadequate controls. Okay, so inadequate system, inadequate roles and responsibilities of all workplace parties, compliance. Okay, factored also into the underlying causes. So the individual factors or the actual work factors at the particular operation, the immediate causes, substandard activity, okay, practices, the behavior of staff, leading to the event or the incident, which is potential loss and production of the event, and then loss. It could be an individual work. It could be off work on an LTI or a lost time injury, right? Excuse me. Working back from the right to the left, okay? Once these instances have occurred, we want to begin to look at our problem-solving model, okay? And we factor in, well, what were the immediate causes, okay? So what were the substandard acts or the practices? Factor in the individuals, but, it's going to boil down to then is, the system, okay? The health and safety system in general, the roles and responsibilities of all workplace parties. Do we have the applicable standard operating procedures or safe work procedures in place to put all of those in place that are going to hopefully then eliminate, right, or reduce that incident from occurring, okay? So we speak to the internal responsibility system, and I think probably everybody is somewhat familiar with the internal responsibility system, but it is the foundation of health and safety law in Ontario. For our group here, for primarily our OGBG membership, okay, so we're familiar with the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and for most, the regulations that are going to pertain to you would be the farming regulations, but it is an employer and a worker's responsibility. They're sharing that responsibility for health and safety. And as I bring up the next point on the slide, obviously it is the employer, he or she, that has the most responsibility in regards to health and safety. They're required to have certain policies in place. They're the one that's going to implement the program. Your supervisors, crew leaders, managers, lead hands, whatever the term is that you use, they essentially are communicating, monitoring, and they're enforcing the programs and the policies. Okay, so they essentially are the eyes and ears of the employer when they're not out in the greenhouse range or in the greenhouse phase. And very important too, just as a takeaway, to remind workers or employees, they have a legal duty and responsibility to comply with those rules and procedures that the employer has put in place, to participate, as you'll learn moving forward, to participate in hazard assessments or in HERAs. And as well, they have a legal duty and responsibility to bring concerns to the attention of the company. And in regards to that particular bullet point, workers need to be reminded that they have a legal duty and responsibility to report hazards, right, to their employer or to their supervisor. From our Joint Health and Safety Committee standpoint, or a health and safety representative standpoint, those individuals on the committee, or that individual as the rep, they are monitoring the system. They're making recommendations to the employer, and they're supporting communication between the parties. So when we look at this slide and we think about the internal responsibility system, and we think about hazard assessments or reporting of hazards, obviously the committee and the health and safety representative, they have a legal duty and a responsibility to conduct monthly workplace inspections. One of the primary functions of conducting the monthly workplace inspections is to identify hazards. You may have some in the session today that their supervisors are required to conduct a departmental inspection, another set of eyes identifying other hazards that could be in that particular department. But from the worker's standpoint, they do have a responsibility, and it becomes everyone's responsibility in regards to health and safety, that if there is a worker representative on the Joint Health and Safety Committee, or there is a health and safety representative that is conducting, that monthly workplace inspection, and let's say that they're conducting it on Friday, and they happen to miss something, I think it's very important that workers understand that, if they see that individual miss a particular guard off a piece of machinery, they can either go to the representative on the committee, or they can go to the health and safety representative and say, did you not see that guard that's missing? Or they can report that to their supervisor. So it's a way with all parties here under the IRS to capture, right, and identify those particular hazards that could be found within the workplace. Okay. So the role there, as I had alluded to, identifying those workplace health and safety concerns as they're conducting their monthly workplace inspections. They're assisting the employer in prioritizing hazards. As an example, just last week, I was doing an in-person certification part 1, which is 3 days. And there is a particular module that we go through for the committee members. It's called Workplace Inspections. And I was pointing out to them that on our WSPS template that we provide free of charge to download off the website, as you're identifying those hazards, there's actually a risk evaluation chart in the top right-hand corner, which allows the individual that is conducting the inspection, that once they've identified the hazard, to prioritize, whether it's going to be a high, whether it's a medium, or it's a low. Okay, they're monitoring the IRS and implementation of control programs that could be put in place in regards to hazards. And then as well, from a committee standpoint or a representative standpoint, they can make recommendations for program improvement and controls in the workplace based off of their monthly workplace inspections that they're conducting. Okay. So we're just going to walk through the hazard categories, and I'm just going to bring this up in a bit, or Kristen's going to, okay? But when we talk about our hazard categories and we talk about hazards, we have 2 types of hazards, okay? So we have health hazards that have the potential to cause illness, disease, or other health conditions, okay? And this could be both acute, okay, so immediate. This could be chronic, long-term. And if we're not identifying these particular hazards within the workplace and putting the proper controls in place for our employees or our workers, this potentially could lead to an occupational illness. So some type of long-term injury that could lead to an occupational illness with a worker, which actually could become a WSIB claim. Okay. Our safety hazards, those are the ones that have the potential to cause injury. And this could be a slip, trip, or fall. This could be, contact with, a forklift. This could be as well, lockout, tagout, right? So safety hazards in that sense. Okay. So here are our hazard categories. And we've got 6 hazard categories in the pie wheel, or the pie chart. Safety, physical, chemical, biological, MSD, and psychosocial. And for the group, just before we do bring up the poll questions, how many would feel, just use the chat function, how many would feel that they have all 6 hazard categories present at their particular workplace? And I'll just give it a second just to see the responses. Because it's just interesting over the years in doing training that you would be talking to individuals about the hazard pie chart, and certain individuals or participants would say, well, we've got 5, but we don't have all 6. But I think one thing that we've realized over the past 3 years is that now most businesses will have all 6 hazard categories present at their particular workplace. So I'm going to call upon my colleague, Kristen, to bring in the poll question. And the first poll question is, what hazard category best describes the noisy box making machine? Would that be safety, psychosocial, MSD, biological, chemical, or would that be physical?
Just a reminder, once you do select and submit your response, you can use the X to close that window and or done at the bottom of that window to close.
Okay, so I'm just, Kristen, as you're just on there, I see 7 responses. And how many participants do we have in the, now I see 10. Excellent. And we got a good group here because a lot of the times when we talk about, noisy box making machine, excuse me, some people will think that that is safety, but the correct answer is noisy box making machine is going to fall into the physical hazard category. And the physical hazard category would be heat, cold, noise, vibration, and radiation. And just knowing, the work that I've done over the years with OGVG membership and being in greenhouses, you definitely are going to have physical. And it's not just, for OGVG membership, the other participants that are on in the session today, whether it's outside of the agricultural sector, you very well could have workers that are working outdoors. They're being exposed to, heat during the hot and humid summer months. Cold, if we've got a cold storage area for the produce. Noise, definitely, in regards to, I know there's newer box making machines, there's some older box making machines, individuals working outside, exposed to the sun, so UV radiation. And the final one in that physical category would be vibration. And I always point that out in doing sessions, that just think about somebody that's operating a forklift all day, and they're loading a semi truck trailer. Just the constant bouncing in and out of the trailer as they're loading that pallet or loading that skid into the trailer. Okay. So our next poll question here is water on the greenhouse floor. Water in one of the phases or in the greenhouse range. What hazard category is that going to fall into? And I'm just waiting on some of the responses. And I'm not trying to be a trickster, but just so I can monitor the polls, so I can see the answers coming in. I'm selecting the wrong answer, but I see here as well 94% correct have identified that water on the greenhouse floor is as being a safety issue. Okay, so slips, trips, and falls. I'm thinking about water in the greenhouse floor. I'm thinking about individuals possibly that could fall off of a scissor cart. If you've got to change poly or glass, you've got individuals that are up in the gutter of the greenhouses. Them falling. Okay, that's gonna be classified as a safety hazard. Okay, so the next one would be fertilizer. What hazard category would that fall into? Okay, and I'm just looking at some of the responses that are coming in. Excellent. I don't think there's any fooling this group. We know that the fertilizer is going to be classified into the chemical hazard category. So your pesticides, your fertilizers, some of the WHMIS 2015 GHS controlled products that could be used within the industry or within the sector. So that's going to be chemical. Here's another one here, number 4, standing while packing. So we've only got 3 left to choose from. So standing while packing. And I'm just looking at the responses that are coming in. Excellent, 13 responses, and we know that that's going to be, MSD, musculoskeletal disorders. Think about the individuals that are working on a pack line, they're standing there, or individuals that are in a scissor cart throughout the course of the day picking the produce. So that static posture that is occurring with them, that would be MSD. Okay. We have a bullying supervisor. What hazard category would that fall into? Go. We have 5 responses. I'll just wait a little bit more. There we go. 15 responses. Yes, and that falls into psychosocial. Right? So psychosocial hazards. And just, over the years, in doing this and doing particular types of training, psychosocial primarily used to just be violence and harassment. Okay. But now you're also beginning to hear within that psychosocial hazard category other terms such as stress, anxiety, depression, workload at the particular business or the particular operation, attributing to that psychosocial hazard. Okay, and then our final one is rodents. Which one would that fall into? Which hazard category would that fall into? There we go. And that one falls into biological. So I alluded to this before we went through the poll questions that, previously you would talk to groups and say, do you have all 6? And individuals would say, no, I just got 5. It all kind of depends upon the business or the sector. I know in walking through various businesses in the agricultural sector, greenhouses in particular, that you'll see the bait traps located throughout the greenhouse. Other businesses that we'll work with, if it's livestock operations in particular, whether it's turkey, hog, dairy, they're going to have syringes that some of their workers would be using. So that's going to fall into biological. But just going out just over the past couple of years, and where I'm going with this is, it was interesting. I'd be out, I'd be doing sessions, and this hazard pie wheel would show up, and I'd go through with the group and say, do you have all these? And again, they'd say, nope, 5. Meanwhile, I'm standing in front of the room, and they are as well. They're not standing in the front of the room, but I'm standing in front of the room in 2021, 2022, when I was out and about. And I've got a non-surgical face mask that I'm wearing during my presentation. And then I'm trying to prompt them and saying, are you sure you don't have biological? Because biological would obviously fall into the COVID-19. That's going to fall into the biological hazard category. Okay, so those are your 6 hazard categories to become refreshed with or introduced to, that when you are going out and you're conducting those, those hazard assessments or those HERAs, that you want to be factoring in based off of the job or the task that the individual's doing, what particular hazard category, does it fall into? And I will point out to everyone, it's not always just going to be one. You very well could have a job or a task where there's multiple hazard categories associated with that particular task or that job that individual is doing. So as an example, just as a quick example, I think about a forklift operator, someone that could be in the pack house operating the forklift all day, moving skids and pallets from the pack house, right, onto the trailer. Obviously, there's going to be the safety aspect, because there could be contact with another forklift. There could be contact with a pedestrian. There is going to be an MSD factor, okay? MSD factor in the sense of how long are they on that forklift? Are they being instructed to get off the forklift from time to time to stand, stretch, possibly walk around? So it's that static posture from sitting on the forklift. And then as well, I alluded to it earlier, from physical, remember it's heat, cold, noise, vibration, and radiation. We very well could have, vibration as well. So there's one particular task or job as an example where you could have 3 hazard categories associated with that particular job. Okay. So our hazard assessment, as we walk through, okay, we want to use this concept of RACE. Okay, so we call it RACE, and it's recognize, assess, control, and evaluate. And I'm sure probably most participants in the session are somewhat familiar with this or very familiar with it. Okay, when we talk about recognizing, identifying existing or potential hazards, okay, gathering information about that recognized hazard. Right? Once we've identified that particular hazard, now we need to go through and we need to assess. So we need to determine the risk level of that hazard. Right? Once we've done that, we want to attempt to put a control in place. And it's saying there on the slide, where we can, in the perfect world, we'd just be able to eliminate that hazard altogether. But that's not always the case, that we can just eliminate the hazard altogether. Okay, so it says to eliminate or reduce the hazard. And we'll learn a little bit later, okay, if we can't eliminate it, what types of controls can we put in place to reduce the hazard? Okay. Following that, once we put the control in place, you've already done your assessment piece that you've determined the risk level of the hazard. And as you put your controls in place, we want to now come back and we want to reevaluate, okay? And we want to check to see if the hazard has either been eliminated or has it been properly controlled, okay? And we'll speak to the hierarchy of controls in a couple of slides, okay? So how are we going to do this recognition phase, okay? And it says there to learn more about the hazard you identified in your workplace, you need to gather information, right? Go and speak to the workers. Whoever is conducting the hazard assessment, go and speak to that particular individual, that particular employee, right, that is conducting that particular job or that task. Okay. Last year, as an example, I worked on a rather large project with a rather large company in the province of Ontario and conducted 16 hazard identification risk assessments per job. And how we started was essentially interviewing the worker, okay? Interviewing the worker and asking him or her, tell me about your typical day, okay? What do you do throughout the course of your shift, okay? And in some cases, then after that individual telling me how they went about their particular day, they would do demonstration, okay? So go to the source is the key thing. Okay. Additionally, you can look at health and safety documents. So we've already spoken to the workplace inspections, but another source of information is your first aid documents. Okay. So to go to the first aid logbook, right? We've got a number of things that have been taken out of the first aid kit. Why was it taken out of the first aid kit? Is it minor cuts that are occurring in some particular area of the business? Okay. For your more serious injuries, okay, an LTI or a non-lost time injuries, you've got your internal investigation reports, manufacturer specifications, right? Very important. The final bullet point there, shift or maintenance logs. 2 things that I'll speak to, maintenance in regards to, do we have a preventative maintenance program? We have forklifts, we have ladders. Do we have our maintenance department checking those on a regular basis? Or we're not doing that and we're just using the forklift until it just automatically just shuts down in the middle of the pack house, or the ladder is now completely broken. Also factor in shift logs, okay? Shift logs, recognizing we had an incident that occurred, there was a hazard. Oh, I just realized that someone had decided to work an additional 4 hours after their morning shift to assist the afternoon shift because we were short, an individual from coming in. They were going to be late. So fatigue is attributing to that particular hazard. Okay. As well, for this group, hazard alerts and bulletins. And specifically, I'm speaking to OGVG membership, but it was a number of years ago that the former Ministry of Labor, now the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training and Skills Development, had issued a hazard alert in regards to, I refer to it as the vine pulling machines, your tear out machines at the end of the season. It was on the ministry's radar, and they had issued those hazard alerts to the sector. These are the things to be looking out for, and as well as the ministry providing that information out, I know for a fact that OGVG had cascaded that out to their entire membership as well. Okay, so your hazard alerts from both from the ministry as well, you could have internal bulletins, right, of hazards that you've seen an increase to inform your staff. Okay. When identifying individuals and tasks, we want to include the following. Okay, so both regular and infrequent tasks, and I'll speak to that in this sense. For one of the, excuse me, for one of the positions that I had done a HERA on last year, the position was called shipper. So I had met with the individual in the morning, had that, let's go through your day, demonstrate to me some of the things that you had told me that you would do throughout the course of the day. Then I circled back and asked that person, so what types of controls do you have in place in regards to those hazards that you'd identified? And the final thing that I would ask the person, based off of when I was doing the HERA, is there anything that I did not capture today here? Let's say I was there, and I was actually, the one that I'm thinking of, I was there in August. And I asked him, is there anything today here in August that, any hazards that we can't see? And he pointed out, yeah, within within 3 of the loading docks that they had at their particular facility, 3 of the loading docks were not covered. And he had indicated that specifically in the winter months, when they had to be chalking these trailers, and possibly maintenance had not got out to clean the snow and the ice, that was something that he had mentioned that, you know, over the years, there had been some actual incidents that had occurred, as well as some near misses from slipping on the ice during the winter months. So that's just something to consider, that when you're doing these, if there are jobs or tasks that are being done periodically throughout the course of the year or done during certain parts of the season, we also want to capture that as well in our hazard assessment. Okay. As well, a representative sample of staff with a particular job, if all have identified tasks, and consider subgroups. So again, doing those, they had multiple shippers, they had multiple receivers, you know, multiple shunt truck drivers. So it was okay to, you know, just be with one. Okay. As well, you can include, right, the committee or your health and safety rep in identifying those tasks and activities. And even though I had been contracted out or hired by this particular employer to conduct those HERAs, one of the things that they were doing moving forward was to be sharing that information with their Joint Health and Safety Committee membership. And then we're tasking the Joint Health and Safety Committee membership, after the controls, the recommended controls, right, had been put in place, to be doing that follow-up with that particular individual that had participated, right, to ensure, have we put the proper controls in place? Has it reduced the risk? And oh, by the way, was there something possibly that Jay had not captured when he was on site? So it's a continuous process in regards to identifying those particular tasks or those activities. Okay. This is our PEMIP model. If you've ever participated in incident investigations or our certification solutions at WSPS, you would be very, very familiar with this. We're factoring in people, equipment, what material possibly is being used, We want to consider the environment and the process. And the key thing that I would say here, everybody, when we're factoring in and looking at this model, you may not be able to provide data entry for each one. So as we work through, right, people, it's saying what the individuals are doing or what they're not doing, okay? So are they doing it properly, or possibly they have not been properly trained on how to do that, okay? The equipment that is not available. We don't have a forklift, we use a pallet jack, okay? Okay, we're using a pallet jack. Is it adequate for the product, the pallet, the skid that we're moving? Is it being maintained? Okay. It was interesting last year. Again, this particular employer had close to 300 pallet jacks, hand pump pallet jacks at the facility. They had informed me that they had 3 forklift maintenance or forklift mechanics, and those were serviced and inspected on an annual basis. And just having that discussion that, you know, if they're not being properly serviced, you know, purchased brand new, it's going to, you know, it's going to pump properly. I'm not exerting a lot of force, but imagine that if I'm not properly maintaining it after months or years, the more force, right, I could be exerting to use the hand pump to pump that pallet jack or the pump jack up. Okay, we factor in material, defective materials, not enough materials, possibly being provided with the wrong instructions. Okay, environment, things to consider. This is one here that you might have a, you know, a perfectly clean workplace. So when you've identified a hazard and you're trying to work through the PEMIP model, this might be one that maybe there's nothing I can throw down into the environment section, okay? But it is alluding to here, you know, poor workplace layout, you know, housekeeping, right? I've got clutter in the aisleway. I've got clutter or debris on the stairwell, right? Our noise, the heat or cold, the temperatures, factor in, you know, poor lighting. If I've got poor lighting in an aisleway and I'm trying to move boxes, you know, manual material handling, and I don't have that pump cart, you know, if there's debris, right, or, you know, things within the aisleway that could pose a trip hazard, that's all factoring into the environment, right? And then we factor in our process, okay? Repetitive and monotonous tasks, overtime, you know, working alone. This is the PEMIP model that when you're looking at the hazard that you've identified, this is where you begin to fill, you know, these sections out, okay? That if it was, you know, improper lifting, we need to be looking at the individual and saying, well, was there some type of, you know, safe lifting program in place? Oh yes, we do have a safe lifting program in place. But in this particular case, the individual, right, was not adhering to that or following that, okay? Our contributing factors and root cause analysis. So the 5 why methods, okay? Excuse me. Just to give you an idea here, you got a scenario here of a burnout light bulb in a high traffic walkway. So the question is, well, why not report it? Well, maintenance received the request, but no action had been taken, okay? Well, why wasn't it replaced? Well, maintenance indicated that they couldn't take action because they were out of light bulbs, okay? Well, why were we out of light bulbs? Well, the purchasing clerk was off sick. Follow-up question is, well, why not go to the store and just use petty cash? No one to process since the purchasing clerk handles petty cash. And this one's very interesting. Why no cross-training or backup person? Okay. Never thought they would be off for a long period. Poor planning. And I'll give you an example in regards to the cross-training and how important it is. And this is both for, you know, OGVG membership as well as other participants in the session. When I talked last week to the group that I was training with, and we talked about MSD and the types of jobs or tasks that an individual could do. And I asked some of the participants in the room, do you do any job rotation? And there was only one that said, yep, at our particular business, we do job rotation. Individuals are trained, right, on various tasks, so we can rotate them throughout the course of the day, so that they're not doing that same repetitive job or task throughout the course of the day. And most businesses that you talk to and ask, do you do the cross training? No, we don't do that. They like that particular job. That's the job that they're going to do. But when I'm having that discussion with a supervisor, or I'm having that discussion with an employer, we've learned a lot from the pandemic. And in one sense, we've learned that, what are we doing here today? Pre-pandemic Safety Connections were held in person at a local venue. Well, here we go today, we're doing this virtual. But the other thing, when I was heavily involved in 2020 and 2021 and 2022, as WSPS was working with OMAFRA, the Ontario Ministry of Agricultural, Food and Rural Affairs, there at that point in time was funding through OMAFRA for COVID-related issues or tasks in regards to training or gap analysis or audits. And I remember this from the gap analysis and the audit, there was one particular section in there that spoke to the fact of cross-training. And not cross-training from a standpoint of MSD. Cross-training in the standpoint of you have four forklift operators that are within the pack house, and they're responsible for moving produce and getting it onto the trailer. And we had gone out to some places we did it virtual, but you would ask that question. And there was one particular greenhouse in Kingsville, I remember, that right off the hop, and I've known him for a number of years, said, yeah, that was one of the first things we looked at. We looked at that cross-training. We had 4 forklift operators, but we went and found another 8 individuals, and it was a challenge at that initially on to get that training, but found 8 individuals to be the backup. And the reason that they had done that was they were looking at it long-term and saying, there could be a possibility that if those 4 designated forklift operators come down with COVID, we're not going to have any operators. Who's going to be operating the forklift, and who's going to be operating it safely? So that's one of the things that I've pointed out to businesses coming out of the pandemic. A lot of them were doing that cross training. From a COVID-19 related standpoint, it's something to consider and think about in regards to a situation such as this, right? Or as well tie it into, right, which one is one of the biggest hazards in the greenhouse sector, your MSDs, okay? So musculoskeletal disorders, right? So we've done our recognition. Now we need to assess, okay? So the hazard assessment is a process of evaluating and identifying that workplace hazard. And now we need to determine the extent and the severity of the hazard. Right? And you can compare your potential hazards against laws. So you can compare that against the Occupational Health and Safety Act. It goes on to say standards and guidelines, and then rules that apply to your workplace. Assess the risk and prioritize which hazards to work on first. Okay. You might go by a color code. You might go, high, medium, low. I've seen red, orange, yellow. I've seen numbered prioritization, 1, 2, 3. Okay. And we've also thrown this in there too, that when we're talking about an assessment, this is more or less just a plug for everybody on the line. Remember, it is a requirement under the Occupational Health and Safety Act in regards to your workplace violence program to not only have that workplace violence policy and to have a written workplace violence program and be providing training to your staff in regards to that program, but to conduct a workplace violence risk assessment. In talking to a lot of inspectors, this is still something when they are out and about doing their proactive visits and looking into this, a lot of employers have those first three that I mentioned: the policy, the written program, and the training. When the inspector is asking for the workplace violence risk assessment, there have been a number of businesses that have not been able to generate that. So the inspectors always, say to me and to my colleague Kristen, when you have opportunities, whether it's a safety connection, you're doing CERT training, remind participants that needs to be completed. That needs to be done. Okay. So additionally, methods to assess hazards. We've talked about those inspections, investigations that might occur based off of an incident. You've got job hazard analysis. Again, so looking at the job that they're doing, what are all the hazards associated with that? Observations, workplace inspections, the committee member or the rep, possibly not walking up to a fellow colleague, but just more or less observing. Are they doing that particular job or task correctly? Interviews are always good because you're going right to the source. And then you may need exposure monitoring, okay, in assessing hazards in regards to, is it noisy in here? Is it higher than 85 dB? What is the air quality in here? And that's where you could be reaching out to professionals, an occupational hygienist, to conduct, right, and to assist in the assessment of that particular hazard. Okay. Our legislation, our standards and guidelines. All right. So we do have the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and for the growers, primarily you're working with the Occupational Health and Safety Act and then the farming regulations. Be advised, for those that are not familiar, these come out a number of years ago. Agricultural operations actually come under the Occupational Health and Safety Act June 30th of 2006. There was very limited regulations that pertain to farms at that time. There's a couple more that have been added in regards to, noise, the noise regulation and mandatory awareness training, but as well, there is a Ministry of Labor, Immigration Training and Skills Development guidelines, okay? Occupational health and safety guidelines for farming operations in Ontario. And if you're not familiar with it, it is in the resources section. And my colleague Camille will be sending you out an email following the session that will have all the resources. I highly recommend, if you've never seen that, to click on that and take a look at the guidelines that the ministry is providing to farming operations. Some of you may adhere to CSA standards. I know various greenhouses that I work with say, yep, our staff are required to have steel-toed footwear, green patch. Industry standards that may be coming out. OGVG could be providing out, or the manufacturer's guidelines, as it says there on the bottom, in regards to your tear-out machines, vine pulling machines, box making machines, the scissor carts, and then as well your internal policies and procedures. Okay. So yeah, we all know, right? We're operating a forklift, it's a requirement to wear a seatbelt. A lot of businesses have to actually put a policy in place and remind their operators, when you're operating the forklift, we want the seatbelt on. Latest and greatest thing that I've seen over the past couple of years, seeing a lot of these forklift operators now, where the business, when purchasing the forklift, excuse me, has asked for, as opposed to a black colored seatbelt, either a fluorescent blue or a fluorescent orange seatbelt, that then supervisors standing in the pack hall, the pack house, can be monitoring forklift operators from afar and can tell visibly whether or not that they're wearing that seatbelt during operation. Okay, so your standards, legislations, and guidelines. Okay, so we come to estimating the risk level. Okay, you've identified the hazard. The probability there is asking you, how likely is it the hazard will cause injury and or illness? All right, we factor that in, the probability. How often are they doing that? Okay, this one here that comes from WSIB's hazard management tool, and you'd see it on WSPS templates. We use the word probability. Other people sometimes use the likelihood. How likelihood is the task going to be attributed to a hazard? Okay, our severity. How serious could the injury or the illness be? If you were to think of a job or a task and you think severity, well, worst case scenario is a fatality. Okay. Individuals sometimes will say, well, slips, trips, and falls. Falls from the same level, falls from heights. Most people would say, well, falls from heights, right? If I'm going to fall off of a greenhouse, a gutter, or I'm going to fall off of a grain elevator leg, it's probably going to be a pretty serious injury. Okay. We also need to consider, though, too, fall from the same level, just possibly the way that the individual falls, they slip on some ice and they hit their head on the pavement in the parking lot. It could result in a sprain. It could result in a fracture. It actually could result in a fatality. Right? So your probability and your severity, but you match those two together, that is going to determine what your risk level is. Okay? So if I bring this up, we factor in a probability of injury being medium. We factor in a severity of injury being major. Okay? Our risk evaluation, or our risk, is going to tell us that the probability of injury being medium and the severity being major is high risk. Okay. So that's the assessment piece in regards to estimating, right, that particular risk level. Okay. The probability being medium, the severity being major, we know now that it's a high, right, high risk level. Okay. Technical hazard assessments, because there could be things that you're not quite familiar with, and you know that it's a hazard, but I don't necessarily know how to properly assess that. And that's where, there's tools and resources that you can use, right, through WSPS. Okay. And I'll just say this, that if you need us, right, the consultant or the specialist to come out and do the work for you, that's what we refer to as a fee for service. Okay, but there is something that is available to you through the transfer payment agreements, where I'll take as an example on a couple of our colleagues that I work with on my team, machine guarding and robotics. And our specialist is Carol Ann. So if I go back to December of 2021, I had an individual reach out in Chatham, Kent, greenhouse operation, said, we just purchased a new pack line from Holland. I think it's properly guarded. I need another set of eyes on it. And that was something that I was able to set up with Carol Ann, where Carol Ann and I went out and met with the site contact, and Carol Ann walked through the pack house and the new pack line, and was looking at it from a machine guarding perspective, and was providing the on-site contact with, she was communicating to him and he was taking notes. There's no charge for that. Okay, because in particular, what she was pointing out to this particular individual, what we need to remember is what is applicable or legislated in Holland might be totally different, and usually is totally different in Ontario. And there were certain areas within the guarding that Carol Ann was pointing out, if an individual wanted to, they could stick their hand in there and they could become entangled in that particular piece of equipment. So it needed to be properly guarded. Other ones there, confined space, noise, right? If you are unsure as to, well, what is the decibel level? Do I need to wear hearing protection? You could always reach out to us. We do have occupational hygienists. If they're in the area, they can pop in. And one point of thought is, if I'm standing, a meter to 2 meters away from somebody, let's say in the box making area, and I've got to raise my voice to have a conversation with them, that's usually a telltale sign that it is higher than 85 dB. Assistance with workplace violence. You talk about psychological and psychosocial safety. What's the mindset, of your staff? There's another valuable tool, resource, free, available to businesses, guarding minds at work. And then another one on the bottom there is our pedestrian traffic safety, and another team member on my team, Carl Bonello. He's that specialist where he can come out and walk around and say, you've got blind spots here. I would suggest maybe a convex mirror going there, or there could be actual barriers that go down. Or if we've got the vehicular traffic in regards to forklifts and we've got a lot of pedestrians, sometimes an easy quick fix could just be your safety vest, right? The high visibility vests that they're going to be wearing that are going to identify pedestrians that are in that particular area. Okay, so those are technical types of hazard assessments, right? So it says there's so many high hazards. Now what? Okay, you want to focus on the high ones first, right? Based off of your priority. Okay. And divide and conquer. Okay. And this may very well be something that if I've got a health and safety coordinator that's conducted this hazard assessment, I want to utilize my joint health and safety committee. I want to sit down with the health and safety representative. I want to pull in senior leadership and say, we've identified 6 high hazards here. And 2 of these, right? If something goes horribly wrong, this could result in a serious injury or fatality, right? We want to prioritize that. We want to begin to, implement, right? Implement those controls and reach out, right, to your designated health and safety association. So for WSPS, we look after agriculture, manufacturing, and the service sector. And there's various people within the organization, on my team, on Kristen's team, that we've got that area of expertise, that knowledge, that it's just another set of eyes, guidance, advice. Here's how I, right, would recommend or suggest that you go about, right, and putting the control in that for that particular hazard. Okay. So the control is how you're going to eliminate or minimize the hazard. Okay. There may be legislated or regulatory controls. So for this group, there are legislated controls that need to be put in place because the noise regulation now pertains to all sectors in the province of Ontario. Okay. And it says there as well, right? Regulatory controls, workplace wearing a seatbelt in vehicles on the highway, Highway Traffic Act. Okay. But the controls must do the following: adequately control the hazards. Okay. Protect all workers and not create any new hazards. So that's why when we put the control in place, we want to circle back on our final step to do the evaluation phase to ensure we haven't created any new hazards from that particular control, right? And you can check, again, that PEMIT fishbone model. So the people, equipment, materials, environment, and process, okay? And use the 5 whys for finding those clues, okay? The implementation, strategy, consult legislation, standards, and guidelines. So to go back to that operation that brought in the new PAC line, that was something that I followed back up with the on-site contact after the fact and said, do you have a procurement plan? Do you have a written procurement plan in place that moving forward, if you're to be purchasing things outside of Canada, let's say you're purchasing it from Europe, these types of questions to be asking is saying, when it comes over and it's going to be installed, is it going to meet requirements in Ontario? Right? Is it going to meet requirements of CSA? Is it going to meet requirements of the Occupational Health and Safety Act? Okay. So there's our hierarchy of controls. And as I alluded to earlier, we always want to start at the top and want to work our way down. And you have elimination. Can we eliminate that hazard altogether? A lot of the times you can't necessarily do that unless you're going to just remove the chemicals altogether. But I'll give you an example where our organization was actually able to eliminate a particular hazard during the pandemic. And that particular hazard, for me as a consultant and the territory that I told you that I cover, for a good portion of 2020, actually from March 14th of 2020 until July 8th, Where I am right now in my home office, in my basement, that's where I was from March 14th to July 8th. So the hazard that was eliminated was motor vehicle, right? Motor vehicle incident, because I spent a lot of time on the road. Okay. So we were able to eliminate that hazard. Okay. But that actually created another hazard, because then it got into an MSD hazard, because I was primarily parked at my desk throughout the course of, 3.5 months. But can we eliminate it? Can we substitute it? Okay. Could we use something less hazardous? Could we put in an engineering control? I'll give you a couple of examples. I mean, we all saw this during the pandemic. They're still around at some places, but you'd go into the grocery store, you'd go into Shoppers, you would go into the LCBO, you'd go to the checkout counter and you'd see that plexiglass barrier. So there's an engineering control. Another one, when I'm out and I'm conducting noise assessments and I'll provide the report back to the client after the fact, is a lot of people always gravitate towards, oh, it's noisy, let's just get them earplugs and earmuffs. Can I put in some type of engineering control that's going to muffle the sound? Okay. So engineering, awareness, signage, okay, posters that could be up, right? Training. Your administrative would fall into your, having policies, okay? Change that I've seen in the greenhouse sector, in the agricultural sector in general, from 1999 when I started to now, a lot of these businesses will have designated operators. I have, a fleet of 8 forklifts, and I have 12 designated operators. I have a staff of 30, but only 2 people are allowed to operate the tractor. Okay? That's in their internal policy or procedure. And then your PPE. Is it goggles? Is it a face shield? Is it an N95? Is it a cartridge-filled respirator? Is it the plugs? Is it the muffs? Okay. So some controls there, it says, are more effective than others, and it's asking you, well, why do you think this might be? And I'll just tell you why you want to start at the top and work your way down. If you just gravitate towards PPE, what we're relying on is human compliance. We're relying on that individual that we've instructed him or her, when you're doing this particular job, you will wear that hearing protection. 95% of our staff probably will. There might be 5% that don't. But if we look at it from an engineering control, we can muffle the sound and reduce the level below 85. Okay, there may not be a need or a requirement to wear that PPE. Okay. Your location of controls, we want to start at the source and then we want to work our way along. So we're starting at the source. Can we put the control in there at the source? If we can't put the control in at the source, we're going to go along the path in the form of ventilation, as the slide shows. And then if we can't do at the source or along the path, then finally, right, we're at the worker. Okay? So comprehensive risk control, multiple contributing factors require multiple controls to minimize the risk. And I'll just go back to that one. As an example, I've seen this a lot. You've got multiple controls that have been put in place. You have that pedestrian, vehicular interaction. Some businesses, so on the forklift, you may have seen this. It's the blue light at the front, the blue light at the back that projects that blue light that says that the forklift's coming into an area. You could have a physical barrier where vehicular traffic is on the left, pedestrian traffic is on the right as well. Another control, the individuals are wearing those high visibility vests. So there's 3 controls that have been put in place to try and minimize that particular risk. Right? So again, use the contributing factors for root cause control, right? Improve individual decision-making, the training, the mentorship, respect individuals' limitations. So, following up with those individuals, the equipment, okay? Try to make equipment safer, make sure that it's properly maintained. Also pointing out there, providing ergonomic tools, lift gates on vehicles, your material, safer materials, lighter containers. I know something for our organization that was identified with the amount of materials that we get. You know, there's a weight limit now on the boxes when we're doing public or on-site training, so that we're not, you know what I mean, overexerting ourselves. Your environment, okay, non-slip flooring, improve ventilation, install electrical outlets where needed, and then your process, improve systems, daily task hazard assessment, maintenance plans. You know, those monthly workplace inspections that the committee or the worker representatives doing, that's fantastic, right? But let's get that buy-in from, you know, other individuals at the particular facility, you know, in regards to the IRS, where supervisors could be doing, you know, that walk around or reminding workers to report hazards, because it becomes a, you know, a different set of eyes to capture those, okay? And work and or workplace that is safe and healthy by factoring all those in. Right? So now we come back on our final step. We've done our recognition, we've done our assessment, we put those controls in place. We got to do our final step in regards to evaluation. Okay, how well are those controls working? We're now going to circle back and we're going to estimate that risk again and identify any new hazards as a result of the control. Okay. Again, evaluation, how likely is the hazard to cause injury and or illness? Okay. Is it going to be a high, medium, or low? How serious? Major, moderate, or minor? What's the risk level for this hazard now? High, medium, or low? Okay. If you remember earlier, when I first brought this up from the assessment phase, our probability of injury had been medium. Okay. In our scenario now, we've put the control in place. Okay. So we've moved the probability of injury from being a medium to a low. Okay. But you'll notice the severity has still stayed the same in regards to major. We've moved our risk level from high to medium. I think the important thing for everyone to understand when you're conducting a hazard assessment or you're conducting a HERA, whatever you want to refer to it as, unless you've eliminated that hazard altogether, based off of your assessment phase, unless you've eliminated the hazard altogether, your severity is not going to change. Okay, so previously we did have major, it stays major here, but based off of the controls that we've put in place, right, we've reduced that to low. Okay, because if you put a control in place and we circle back to when we had gone through the hierarchy of controls, and that particular control is only PPE, right? Remember, we're relying on that human compliance. If that even though we've provided it, if that individual, he or she decides not to wear it and something goes horribly wrong, if we had determined before that it was going to be major, it's still going to be major. Okay. So remember, unless we've eliminated altogether, okay, your severity is going to stay the same. Okay. So your maintenance, this should never just be a one-off. You don't just want to identify the hazards and then just, I mean, review it and then let it sit on the shelf. We want to ensure, right, that we're maintaining this hazard assessment. You know, new equipment that comes into the business, right, to effectively check to see how those controls, you know, are working. Okay, you know, new pieces of personal protective equipment. Okay, so consider the following though: changes to jobs or tasks. You know, brand new automated pack line for that greenhouse that we went to go and visit. Okay, now they hadn't done a hazard assessment, right? They were primarily looking at it from a machine guarding aspect. Okay, but to consider now, okay, we got different people located throughout, right, the pack house or the pack line, right? Moves or renovations of the facilities, right? World events, COVID, right? I mean, COVID, we really had to change and adjust on the fly. And it's interesting in talking to clients over the past 3 years, as it seems that it's somewhat back to normal and I'm back out more than ever. But to ask businesses, so tell me how it really affected you back in March of 2020. And a lot of businesses were telling me, yeah, once we got it sorted out, you know, the wearing of the masks and the physical distancing and how many people could go into the break room and how many people could go into the washroom, it was business as usual, or our business just ramped up through the roof. Where for Kristen and myself, right, it was a little different, where we were the world events really had an impact upon us because we had to do a lot of stuff virtual. People did not want us coming out, right, to their facilities. Okay. You got new roles. So you've got. I spoke to an individual. Excuse me. I spoke to an individual this morning prior to the session. Done some work with them in the past. My previous site contact retired last year. So this new individual, he's taken on the health and safety at the particular business. And we were just kind of going through, and he was like, what do I have to have in place? What is required? And, so that was more from a legislative standpoint, but that could be something that if somebody had conducted a hazard assessment, and I had conducted them and I left the business and Kristen's now taking over my role, she can go through and she can review, and, maybe Jay didn't capture everything. Maybe we need to, revisit that and ensure that it's properly maintained. Okay. From a resources standpoint, I've talked about this again, how it works, TPA agreements. You want us to just have a visit with you and point out some things. You're going to take the notes. No charge for that. Okay. But you say, I'm not the professional. I'm not comfortable in doing this on my own. I'm worried that I'm going to miss something. You can reach out to WSPS and we can come in. And as I had alluded to, we do the HEROES. Okay, the hazard identification risk assessments. We do legislative compliance audits. You're wondering, do I have all my I's dotted, T's crossed? Another set of I's. Okay, another set of I's. I don't know if she's in the room today. She had said yesterday that she was going to be joining, but doing a legislative compliance audit with a colleague last year. And one of the key things we captured, I guess would be the word. This particular business that we had gone to look at their policies, their procedures in regards to their Joint Health and Safety Committee. We were there in April, had their management representative on the JHSC conducting the workplace inspection for January, February, and March. And we had to point out to the health and safety coordinator, that's a no-no. The management representative can go with the worker representative, but it is the worker representative that is required and responsible to be conducting those inspections. And I've mentioned the technical hazard assessments, so pedestrian traffic safety assessments, the machine guarding assessment, robotic assessment, confined space is another one, indoor air quality, and noise assessment we have as well, right? Resources from a training aspect, just for the growers, OGVG primarily our membership that may be on the line. Your requirement to have a joint health and safety committee, you are required as a greenhouse grower to have a joint health and safety committee when you have 20 to 49 workers. That must be made up of 1 part management, 1 part worker. Your committee is not required to be certified until your operation, your business exceeds more than 49 workers, so 50 plus. If that is the case, you've got, let's say, 162 workers at the greenhouse, then your requirement is to have a committee made up of 2 parts management, 2 parts worker, of which a worker representative and a management representative must be certified. Certification part 1 is 3 days. To become fully certified, you're required to take certification part 2. Certification part 2 is 2 days. WSPS offers certification part 2 for both agriculture, manufacturing, office, service, and warehousing. Additional courses that we have, managing hazards, that's a half-day course. Kristen and I worked on the bottom one, along with some other colleagues at WSPS. This was a CPO, Chief Prevention Officer directive. It is safety, health, and the law for greenhouses. And it primarily is kind of a condensed version of CERT Part 1, but it's broken down into 6 modules. You can do the course in 1 full day, or if a business was looking at it and saying, I think Module 1 and Module 3 would be very important for our supervisors or for our senior leadership, we can come and do that on site. Right? There is our agricultural and horticultural safety center. As well, additional tools, how to identify and assess your hazards, hazard assessment tool video. You can also pull the hazard assessment sheet or the form from our website. There it is on the bottom. The instructions on how to work through it. And if you do pull it and you're working through it, I always stress to participants, probably the most important column on that hazard assessment template is column G. That's the legal requirements. You know, I found this hazard. What are the legal requirements that pertain to this particular hazard? Okay, because if there's not agreement, or possibly there is some pushback, that is a very good avenue to pull the legislative requirements and to inform whether it is a supervisor, an employer, the powers that be. We need to do this because this is the legislation, and at present we are not adhering to that. Other resources we've thrown in here, and Camille will send this out after the fact. So a guide to the Occupational Health and Safety Act for farming operations. Additionally, a guide for health and safety committees and representatives in farming operations, health and safety in farming operations in general, our e-laws, and just I'll circle back that third one. No, there it is. Sorry, it is the third one, the health and safety in farming operations. That will take you to the guidelines. So there's guidelines in and around tractors, lifting, confined spaces, so guidelines that you can follow. And then the final one, just before we wrap up, there are 2 additional safety connections set up for March in collaboration with OGVG, and that the first one being ergonomics in agriculture, which is a very big one in the sector, as well as mental health. As well, it doesn't happen too often, but in actually 2 weeks, March 1st and March 2nd, at OGVG, the course is running. There's participants registered as of now, but there will be a certification part 2 agricultural 2-day course that's being held at OGVG. So if there are any growers in the room that possibly, you know, have your part 1 and you have looked at the website and said, oh, there's part 2, but it's all virtual, I'm just letting you know, I'd love to have additional participants at that course. And one final thing before I do turn it back over to Kristen, the Safety, Health, and the Law for Greenhouses course. Unfortunately, registration is closed, but it is running tomorrow at OGVG. But in prep yesterday, that got Kristen and I to think about moving forward, and a course will be scheduled in the St. Catharines area in person for November. And there will be an additional Safety, Health, and the Law for Greenhouses course at the Leamington location, OGVG, in October. And once those are scheduled, just be on the lookout when you receive notification either from Richard at OGVG or my little pool of contacts that I have for the Leamington and Kingsville area. I'll be sending that out if anyone is interested in sending senior leadership, managers, supervisors, workers in general, or joint health and safety committee members, health and safety representatives. And with that, you've got the chat and you're on mute, so you got to tell me whether there's any questions.
That's what I'm here to do, and there are not.
Oh, all right.
There are not at this point, but
is anybody still with us?
There are many in the meeting still. So
hi, Donna.
Yeah, thanks, Donna. So at this point, Jay and I are available for questions. We thank you for your attendance and for those that did contribute to the discussion or take away information from the session. If you wish, within the chat, we welcome you to contribute still any questions, feedback, requests on particular types of hazards, for example. As well, I will launch a poll now that is an opportunity for you to indicate contact information, in particular your email address, if you do not mind for it to be visible and wish for Jay and or I to contact you. That said, and Jay did mention, our colleague Camille, who is in the background for support now, but is going to follow up with all of the attendees and registrants after the session with the resources that were listed. You will also receive the contact information for Jay and I, although Jay was the star here. So either or, though, we work together quite often to find the solutions, even if we might not have them individually. So for those who do wish to receive direct contact, we welcome you to share your contact information here. But as I said, you will receive an email to the registration email address you provided. And in that, you will have contact information for Jay and I, as well as our general contact. So in future, whether on this topic or otherwise, certainly through the individuals you may be familiar with, we can direct you to the appropriate resources. That said, our general information, WSPS.ca, we're likely registered for this session, does provide you with access to our customer care contact center through our 877 number, as well directs you to some of the specialists based on sector or type of hazard. So please do engage. And once more, we thank you for your involvement today. Thank you, Jay.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks, everybody. A little bit better when you got content and slide deck, as opposed to navigating the WSPS website.
Both.
Thanks,
were
Donna.
awesome.
Hope to see you. Hope to see you soon.
For those who are still in and in earshot, again, Jay and I will hang out for a few more minutes until noon. If you do have any questions within the chat, please do. Otherwise, we hope to connect with you in the future.
Yeah, you probably could see better than I could, but what was our total numbers at peak? Was there like 20, 25?
I think over 30.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sure Camille will send something out because
Yep.
or Camille can just tell me. So because I told Camille earlier, I wanted to tell Richard tomorrow when I saw him what was
Sure.
the numbers. And I think for the most part, it seemed like there was a lot of growers, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Some familiar names, but also even through the registration list. Yeah, agree.